Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfic. Today will be the continuation of Burn Your Wings. This will be Part 5, Chapter 5, entitled, And It Certainly Isn't Kind. After classes have let out, Aizawa is looking over the written report of Class 1A's trial of battle that All Might had oversaw earlier that day. He's doing his best to ignore All Might's all-mightness sprinkled throughout the report. And then young Midoriya pulls an Eraserhead on young Bakugo and binds him with the capture tape in a truly stunning move. When the intercom rings, Aizawa, he says as he picks it up, almost glad for the distraction. This is Recovery Girl. The elderly nurse's voice comes over the line. I need you to talk with me about one of your students, Midoriya Izuku. Of course she does, and of course it's him. Midoriya has been the only one in Aizawa's class to have seen the nurse, after all, both yesterday and today. No matter how bright and well-intentioned he may be, Aizawa has the creeping suspicion that this one's going to be a problem child. He sighs. How bad was it this time? A first-degree burn, blisters, cuts, and bruises, but that's not the reason I'm calling. And oh, does that sound promising. I noticed something while treating him today, so I pulled out his student file. It looks like he requested long sleeves on all of his uniforms, including the PE and summer uniforms. But today, he came in with half of the left sleeve of his costume tattered, so I got a look at his left forearm, and at least. Normally I wouldn't break patient confidentiality, but these are children, students, and we are their teachers. You are his teacher, so I think you should know this. She pauses, and Aizawa feels as if his breath stills with her. Aizawa, he has scars all over his arm. The breath that he'd held comes out in a low hiss. Recovery Girl continues. They were old. I'd say at least 5, maybe even over 10 years old, treated by an amateur, too, and he didn't deny it when I guessed that he'd treated it himself instead of getting proper medical attention. And they're not just from ordinary scrapes, these were knife marks. They were focused on the outside of his forearm, suggesting that he had been trying to shield himself from someone larger wielding a knife. And Aizawa... Recovery Girl pauses once more, and Aizawa feels his breath catch in his throat again. That was just his left forearm. I didn't get to see the entire arm, let alone the rest of his body, and I fear what I might find. Silence falls between them. Aizawa pictures Midoriya in his mind. He remembers how the kid had immediately recognized him, not as his teacher, but as the hero Eraserhead. He recalls how he'd forgotten Aizawa, as if he'd looked at him, as if Aizawa hung the entire moon itself, how he hadn't even flinched at pain, and even smiled through it, as if far too used to pain for one shattered finger to really bother him. And now the scars. There's one vague yet glaringly obvious answer that links all those together. Did he say how he was scarred? The nurse sighs at Aizawa's quiet question. No, I wouldn't have been as worried if he had. Aizawa hides a grimace in the folds of his capture weapon. Yeah, he'd thought the kid wouldn't talk, but from what little Aizawa had seen of Midoriya Izuku, he can tell that he's not the type of person that goes around showing off his wounds and scars, both literal and figurative. I'll keep an eye out and see what I can do. Thank you for telling me, Aizawa ends up saying. Of course, Recovery Girl replies. It's our duty to look after our students, after all. Oh, and I'll be telling this to All Might, too, just so you know. Aizawa's eyebrows quirk up at that. Aizawa himself had been teaching and dealing with teenagers long enough to know that this kind of problem, a student perhaps having been the victim of a villain activity, the possibility of abuse, probably some lingering trauma, has to be treated with care and caution, lest they worsen the situation. Children are malleable, after all, but All Might lacks the experience in teaching to know to be delicate instead of using his usual loud and bright self. Don't worry, Recovery Girl assures, as if picking up on his unease. I'll talk to him, tell him to approach this carefully, and he needs to know this. Well then. And it's not like Aizawa hasn't suspected there might be something between his problem child and the number 1 hero. It's clear that All Might is trying his best to stay unbiased and fair, but he's the type of person who wears their heart on their sleeve, for better or worse. His fondness for Midoriya is painfully obvious. And as for Midoriya as well, his adoration for All Might is only rivaled by that of Aizawa himself, which Aizawa can't afford to ignore anymore. He bids a subdued farewell to Recovery Girl and hangs up. Aizawa stares blankly at the phone for a moment, then he slowly reaches out a hand to pick up the receiver again. He punches in a line of numbers that he hasn't called in a long time. This is Eraserhead, he says as soon as the line is picked up, not even pausing for a greeting. I need a favor. Every arrest, scuffle, or incident that I was a part of for the past 10 to 5 years. I need a file on every single one as soon as possible. He pauses. Especially anything that's related to a child. Izuku is confused. When Aizawa is in the vicinity, it's only natural for Izuku's attention to zoom in and focus on his hero. He can't help it. He's already gone through this phase with All Might too, though months of exposition has already at least toned down the sheer starstruck awe that surfaces in the presence of the number one hero. It's yet to wear off for his other hero, though. But the confusing thing is, Aizawa is looking at Izuku too now. It's not obvious, it's subtle, and even Izuku might not have noticed if he hadn't himself already been hyper-aware of Aizawa, but no matter how secretive Aizawa is about it, it's undeniable that he does. It probably is something about Izuku that at the realization that his hero is watching him, his heart jumps with fear rather than joy. His mind races. Why? What did he do to single himself out? Izuku did get elected as class president, only to promptly hand over the position to Ida, but Aizawa's scrutiny had begun even before that incident. Maybe it had something to do with something that happened in the battle trial, but then wouldn't he have said something when he was giving them feedback? Then what? Why? Could it be he's made the connection between Izuku and Hisashi? No, Izuku tells himself forcefully. He can't have. It's not possible. Hisashi may have been the domineering shadow looming over Izuku's life, but to Aizawa he has only ever been one of the many villains that Eraserhead took down. And that was a full decade ago. No matter how good Aizawa's memory may be, there's just no way he can possibly remember Hisashi. That's what Izuku tells himself as he gets on the bus for their trial of rescue, and Aizawa's gaze lingers on him for a moment too long. Not that he hasn't thought, imagined, dreamed about telling Eraserhead that he'd saved him, and his mother, and thanking the hero. Of course he has. But now that he's Izuku's homeroom teacher, things aren't as simple as that. Izuku is worried that if he tells Aizawa, he'll remember Hisashi, that he'll remember how Hisashi had breathed fire and look at Izuku that holds fire back in the flames of his mouth. Izuku is worried, he's terrified shitless, that Aizawa will think he's like his father. He fingers his mouthguard nervously. Thankfully, the unease is mostly dispelled by the rowdy cheer of his classmates and the novelty of Bakugo being teased. Izuku smiles and laughs with his friends. Friends he actually has friends now. During the bus ride, and by the time that they arrive at their destination, an actual USJ, Izuku is calmed down enough to get properly excited at the sight of the space hero, 13, and go into fanboy mode, side by side with Uraraka. His good mood is brought down a notch when he notices 13 subtly signaling to Aizawa that All Might is out of time and won't be joining them, but his attention is soon grasped by the space hero's speech. My quirk is called Black Hole. No matter what material may get sucked into its vortex, I'm afraid it will turn into dust. I use this to remove wreckage and save people from disasters. However, it's also a power that can easily be used to kill people. The hero pauses, and in that way it is no different from the quirks of everyone else here. At those words, a shiver goes through Izuku. His back burns. 13 continues talking about quirks in present-day society, how one misstep is all it takes to accidentally kill someone. Izuku listens with his left fist clenched, nails digging into his palm. Recovery Girl has healed all of the burns on his palm, but for some reason it still itches. If he hadn't blocked the flames with his hand, then someone else may have suffered for it. But then 13's grim speech takes a turn. In this lesson, we'll be studying how to use the quirks that we have for the sake of human life. Izuku's fist unclenches. Your quirk, emphatically, they do not exist to hurt others. Please leave this exercise having fully understood that your quirk exists to help people. His classmates burst into an uproar of enthusiastic applause as 13 takes a bow, but all Izuku can do is stare at the hero. He already knows, of course, the duality of quirks, that there are countless villains with strength enhancement quirks, but All Might used his to become number 1 hero. Even Endeavor, the number 2 hero, has a fire quirk, yet uses it not for villainy but for heroism. But the thing is, Izuku has never been able to think of his fire in the same way. Izuku's fire is his father's, and he has seen it hurt Inko too many times, has felt it burn himself too many times to dare think of it as anything other than pain and destruction. It has only ever hurt. Izuku thinks it can't possibly protect. His fire has been tainted even before it was ever his. But for some reason, 13's words jostle something inside him. Before he can think more on it, though, he hears Aizawa shout out in a panicked voice that he's never heard from the usually calm hero. "Keep together and don't move," he barks suddenly. "No, 13, protect the students." His classmates are mostly confused, but Izuku's blood runs cold because he knows Eraserhead, and he knows the hero wouldn't be acting this way for anything less than a mortal crisis. "Stay back," Izuku warns as he flings an arm out in front of Kirishima, who'd been trying to step closer and get a better view of the people suddenly emerging in the square down below them. Aizawa's gaze briefly flickers to Izuku, and he thinks he sees approval and gratitude underneath the tension in his gaze, before the man fixes his goggles over his eyes and turns to the people spilling into the plaza. "Midoriya's right. Don't move. Those are villains." As if to prove this, a misty black man muses after looking over them. Eraserhead and 13. According to the teacher's curriculum we procured yesterday, All Might was supposed to be here, and yet... And doesn't that sound ominous? A thin man with severed hands clinging all over his body throws his head back. "Where is he? We went through all this trouble and rustled up so many to bring along. You can't tell me All Might, the symbol of peace, isn't here." He cocks his head to one side. "I wonder if he'll show up if we kill the kids." A shock seems to go through the entire class as they finally realize what they're facing. Villains. Some panic, while some speculate about one of the villains jamming the intruder alarm sensors, though through it all, Aizawa steps forward with his back to the class. 13, do the evacuation procedure and try calling the school, he instructs, and he grasps the capture weapon around his shoulders. Sensei, you're not going to fight them all alone, are you? Izuku calls in alarm, because he knows Eraserhead, and knows that his fighting style isn't suited for a group combat like this. But the hero, his hero, just glances back at him with a tiny quirk of a smile that is mostly hidden in the folds of his capture weapon. A hero always has more than one trick up their sleeve. And with that, he turns away and launches himself into the midst of the villains. Eraserhead, proceeds to decimate their ranks, erasing quirks and using his formidable hand-to-hand combat as a capture weapon on any that he can't. Some of his classmates seem to breathe a sigh of relief, but Izuku is still rooted to the spot and has his heart in his throat, because he knows that this isn't Eraserhead's forte, and Izuku can't even tell how much danger their teacher is actually in, because as much as he understands just how dangerous this situation is, Izuku also understands exactly why he'd taken the risk. The hero must have purposefully thrown himself into the fray in order to set them at ease, and Izuku can't disrespect that by calling out his ruse and throwing everyone into worry and panic. Izuku's the only one who knows. Izuku is the only one who worries and panics right now. "Come on, Midoriya," Ida calls. "Let's leave it to Aizawa-sensei and evacuate." Izuku grinds his teeth. Ida has a point. If they can't get out and call for reinforcements, then Aizawa will have a better chance, but he forces himself to turn away from the hero. But of course life isn't fair, and it certainly isn't kind. "I'm afraid I can't allow that." A deceptively polite voice rings out as black mist spreads out before the class, blocking the nearest exit. "Greetings," the villain says demurely. "We are the League of Villains. I apologize for the intrusion, but we took it upon ourselves to enter the UA facility in order to engage All Might, the Beacon of Hope. We were wondering if we may be allowed to extinguish it, you see." And Izuku's blood turns cold. Not only do they have Eraserhead in a tight spot, but they want to kill All Might. They want to kill All Might. It feels like the worst nightmare, and it only worsens when Bakugo and Kirishima rush at the villain. Izuku pulls them back, having noticed 13 flip open the casing on their finger. With the students out of the way, 13 is free to aim their black hole on the warp villain. But even as Izuku smothers the flames that swell up in his mouth against his left palm, he watches in horror as the villain opens a warp gate behind 13, making their own quirk turn against them. The eyes reflected on 13's helmet are wide and with surprise and horror. Izuku knows that feeling only too well. "No!" he shouts desperately, trying to pull 13 out of the loop, but before he can, the villain seems to deem 13 incapacitated enough that he removes the warp gates on his own volition, dropping 13 to the ground. And this time, he turns his attention to the class. "Run!" someone shouts as the black mist envelops them. Izuku grabs Asui, who's closest to him, and pulls them to the other side, just narrowly escaping the dark grasp of the mist. He frantically turns around as soon as they tumble to the ground. Ida and Shoji seem to have been able to grab a few people each, including 13, but most of his classmates are missing. "I wonder if he'll show up if we kill the kids." The villain's words come back to Izuku, and he pales. "The others," he whispers, almost gasps as he smothers the fire in his mouth. We're scattered and in disarray, Shoji tells him, his many arms spread wide with multiple ears and eyes swiveling on their ends. But we're all still within the facility. A choked breath of relief leaves Izuku's mouth. As soon as the instant panic leaves him, Izuku's mind goes into overdrive. Stupid, idiot, useless. He should have been more alert. He should have pushed through the backlash and pulled 13 out of the way instead of being busy trying to swallow down the flames. You're going to have to figure out a way around your limits, he recalls Aizawa saying on the first day of school, before they get you killed. Worse, before they get someone else killed. Izuku grits his teeth. He can't afford to wallow in self-disgust now. With Aizawa fighting in the plaza down below and 13 injured, they have no guiding figure. It's up to them. Ida, he calls tightly, his hand lifting up to the mouthguard from the collarbone and settling it over his face, his eyes never leaving the villain. Ida, I'll hold off the warp villain. When you see your chance, run. Go get help. Because now more than ever, help is what they need. 13 needs medical attention. Their classmates need saving. Eraserhead needs reinforcement. But Ida looks to Izuku with an almost lost expression. In a startling moment of clarity, Izuku understands. The earliest moments he himself has are of those of fear, pain, and destruction. That means that when faced with a malicious intent, he doesn't freeze up and panic because he's used to it, because to him, it's nothing new. But his classmates are different. They haven't grown up with a budding villain controlling their lives. They haven't tiptoed through their childhood with bated breath. They haven't known constant pain or fear. They're normal. And just like normal children, they're at a loss now that they've lost their teachers and are faced with a real threat. Izuku sweeps a glance over his remaining classmates. It's only been a few seconds since 13 collapsed and Izuku instructed Ida, but they're all looking at him, looking to him, because they instinctively feel that he's the only one who's even remotely calm in this situation. And of course he isn't. Of course he isn't calm. Of course he's just as terrified as every one of them, but just like Aizawa jumped to battle the villains for the sake of putting their minds at ease, Izuku can keep up a front for them as well. He sets his mouth in a determined line and turns his eyes to Ida. I know you don't like it, but Ida, you aren't running away. You're running to help. And that's something only you can do, class president. Their eyes meet. Izuku drills in all the sincerity, conviction, and faith he can to Ida through his gaze. It's like 13 said, use your quirk to save others. Ida seems to hesitate for one more moment before steeling himself. Understood, he shouts, as he readies himself and revs his engines, even though it looks like the very thought of leaving his classmates behind physically pains him. The warp villain tuts in false sympathy. You may still be just children, but I'm surprised that you spout all your plans in front of me. Izuku bares his teeth in a grin behind his mask. It doesn't matter if you hear. You won't be able to stop Ida, because you'll be too busy with me. No, Uraraka says as she stands up next to him, along with all of his other classmates that are here. They look shaken and scared, but also determined. You'll be busy with us. Izuku looks at them, surprised, but then his grin becomes more genuine. Asui, try to capture him, Izuku calls out as he dodges the warp gate forming under him, and Shoji envelops another that opens right behind Ida. Asui doesn't even pause to quip her usual "Kami Su" before she whips out her tongue. Sero joins in with his tape, but both that and Asui's tongue pass through the villain's mist-like body. The villain chuckles as if amused. He doesn't even bother to get out of the way. Izuku's mind is in overdrive. Sero and Asui are their only long-range fighters at the moment. Anyone else would have to get close and risk being hurt, except it looks like even if they do get close, they won't be able to have any effect. But if the villain is completely invulnerable, why did he redirect 13's black hole away from himself? Why not just stand there and mock them, like he's doing to them now? He must have a true body in there somewhere. Izuku grasps out with his quirk. He can only pull corporeal things, but there has to be at least some substance to the mist villain, like that suspicious piece of armor. He grabs it and pulls. The villain comes flying towards him with an unbelievable speed. Izuku's startled yelp is mixed with the villain's own surprised gasp. Izuku barely manages to jump out of the way and sidestep the villain, making him shoot past and tumble into the ground behind. A moment of silence settles upon them, only broken as Izuku coughs up fire in his mouthguard, and the villain slowly rises to his feet with narrowed eyes. "What did you just do?" he asked, his false politeness chipping away. Understanding dawns on Izuku, and the barest bones of a plan form in his mind. Even as flames lick at his lips, Izuku bares his teeth in a grin. The lighter something is, the easier it is for him to pull. The mist villain seems to be mostly incorporeal, making his physical attacks useless against him, but that also makes him very, very light, which only means that Izuku is able to toss him around like a rag doll. He pulls again, and this time is prepared to jump out of the way as the villain goes flying past him. Before he even touches the other villain, he pulls again and again and again, probably giving the villain whiplash as he's forced to change his direction mid-fight. The villain sputters, outraged, and whips of black and mist start forming around him. He seems too disoriented to properly open a gate, and Izuku pulls him away from his pitiful attempt at escape. Izuku feels like a matador, luring the bull towards him only to release the pull and step out of the way at the last moment, so the villain goes soaring past him instead of crashing into him. It's just as deadly a game as real bullfight. He can only pull things towards him after all, so if he's a moment too late to relinquish the pull and jump aside, he'll be sent sprawling along with the villain. But he can't afford to let up and let the villain have time to open a warp gate either. "Ida, go!" Seda shouts. Izuku's too focused to be able to spare even a glance at his friends, and everyone can tell that every moment is costing him. Ida shakes off his shock and takes off running, making it through the doors just before Izuku has hit his limit and can't keep pulling successfully anymore. He loses control of the pull halfway through, dragging the warp villain across the enclosure. The backlash from pulling consecutively hits hard. He doubles over, retching into his mask as the fire roars out of his throat with a vengeance. He tries to clamp down on the fire, put a tight lid on it, make it as small as possible. His mask is fireproof, but he'd been warned that it can only take so much heat before its functions start breaking down. And Izuku can't afford to lose his mouthguard now, so he focuses the fire and he forces it to push out of him as small as possible. Feels like trying to stop a crack in a dam with his bare hands. He's doubled over from the force of the fire trying to push out of him, and trying to push it down. Eventually he's forced to his knees, then has to drop to all fours as he gasps and chokes on mouthfuls of fire. Smoke gushes out of the holes in the mask, almost clouding his vision. It's worse than when he'd pulled the 0-point robot, worse than the time that he'd tried to side jump in the quirk assessment test. Izuku had pushed himself to the limit in a desperate attempt to buy time for Ida, and now he's paying the price. "Deku!" Uraraka calls, approaching with a worried look on her face, but as soon her expression turns to horror. "Deku!" "Midoriya!" Just as time he barely manages to lift his head to see the warp villain swoop down in front of him. The slits of light that are in his eyes are narrowed slightly, and his previously amiable voice is furious hiss now. Oh shit. "That's quite enough with you, boy." And black mist burst out from him, enveloping them both. The alarmed shouts of his classmates fade away as Izuku is rushed through the portal. His hands try to hold him up as he lands heavily on the side, disoriented for a moment as he scrambles to his feet. What's this, Kurogiri?" Izuku turns at the bland, almost bored voice to find the villain with hands all over him. "Shigaraki Tomura," the warp villain, Kurogiri, says, as his voice shows clear deference. "No, 13 is incapacitated, but this boy," he spits out in Izuku's direction, "distracted me enough to allow one of the students to escape the facility." The villain, Shigaraki, stills for a moment before starting to furiously scratch his own neck. "Huh. Kurogiri, if you can't be a proper warp gate, now dozens of pros will come, then it's game over for us. Game over." He pauses, then turns his head towards Izuku, who has been watching him warily. "But before we go, maybe I can squeeze in a bonus match. I've never seen Kurogiri so riled up. You sure must have done something to get this unflappable guy like this. Hey, won't you tell me what you did? I hope you're not at least a little bit more fun than your teacher." Shigaraki trails off with a meaningful sideways glance. Izuku tries and risks taking his eyes off of the villain for a moment to steal a glance in the direction. But once he looks, he can't look away. A giant hulking black villain with popping eyes and an exposed brain is crouched on top of Aizawa. A bruised, bleeding, broken Aizawa. Izuku's whole world stills. "Eraserhead," slips out in a disbelieving whisper, because somewhere in the back of Izuku's mind, Aizawa is still his hero before he is his sensei. Aizawa doesn't even stir. "Yeah, Eraserhead didn't even make a proper toy for Nomu. I hope you'll last a little longer." Shigaraki keeps droning on about something, but Izuku isn't even listening. Eraserhead is a hero. His hero. He's saved Izuku and Inko. In Izuku's subconscious, he's on par with All Might. But when Izuku looks at him now, the image of his broken and beaten mother overlaps his hero, and that he can't just... No. Izuku hurls himself at Aizawa and the Nomu, ignoring Shigaraki's indignant protest. He pulls at the villain because he can't pull Aizawa, not in that condition, not with his arms bent in strange angles and blood pooling around him. But the Nomu doesn't even budge. A shocked sound escapes Izuku. The Nomu is big, sure, but it should still be lighter than the robots Izuku had been able to be flinging around with the help of One For All, powering up his pull. Then, does that mean the Nomu is resisting with sheer strength? Izuku's mind goes into overdrive. In the span of a heartbeat, 1,000 thoughts raced in his mind. His pull doesn't work on the Nomu, but he can't afford to use One For All and break his limbs, because even with the Nomu gone, there's still Shigaraki and Kurogiri, who knows how many other villains as well. That only leaves one option, but he can't. Izuku swore to himself, to his mother, to the laughing memory of his father, that he would never use his fire. He especially doesn't want Aizawa to see a flicker of flames coming out of him, lest the hero is reminded of his Ashi. But that's not the reason. It's not that Izuku won't break his oath for Aizawa. He would burn himself 1,000 times if it meant that he could save his hero. But the thing is, this fire, it isn't the kind of fire or power that can save anyone. It only hurts and destroys. It's tainted. It's a quirk that can't save anyone. But then, 13's words come back to him. Your quirks emphatically don't exist to hurt others. Please leave this exercise having fully understood that your quirk exists to help people. The words he himself spoke to Ida come back to him. Use your quirk to save others. Izuku's fire has only ever destroyed what he held dear. It made his mother scream, it made his father laugh, and it burned him. But can destruction lead to salvation? The backlash from trying to pull the Nomu was building up, the fire in him surging upwards and howling to be set free, trying to push out. Still, he hesitates. Man, it's not polite to ignore people when they're talking to you, you know, Shigaraki drawls. Nomu, bash his head. The Nomu lifts Aizawa's bloodied head by his hair and smashes it into the ground. And at that, Izuku snaps. All his life, Izuku has been pushed. He's been pushed away by his mother when she locked him in the broom cupboard. He had been pushed down by his father every time his Ashi beat him. He'd been pushed around by Bakugo for 10 years. He'd been pushed away, pushed down, and pushed around. But for the first time in his life, Izuku pushes back. This concludes Part 5, Chapter 5 of Burn Your Wings. I'll be back with the newest update as soon as possible. As always, thank you all so much for listening.